So I said that we can learn to distinguish the authentic Jesus from counterfeits by understanding the 3 R's of doing good history: relevant sources, responsible method, and restrained results. All right, so in the last couple of minutes, let me open it up for some questions. Yes?
Have you ever brought up the contradiction of Bart, and if so, what did he say?
Oh, actually I did.
Yeah.
It was in our second debate, and that happened in Charlotte at Southern Evangelical Seminary. The place was packed, probably 750 or 700 people. And he came up in one of his rebuttals and he said, why is Mike only appealing to the New Testament literature? What about the Syriac Gospel of Thomas, where it talks about Judas Didymus Thomas, which means the twin? And so why not think that Thomas was a twin? Why not just appeal to this and say, hey, maybe they saw Jesus after he died. They thought they saw Jesus because they saw his identical twin, Thomas. Why doesn't he look at that and consider that as a source? And so when I got up in my rebuttal, I said, okay, this is what Bart said. But there is a scholar that has equal qualifications as Bart. In fact, I know it's someone, it's an expert on this ancient literature, Gnostic literature, and it's also someone that I know Bart has a lot of respect for. And let's see what he had to say. And I put the quote up there, and then I said, now who's the scholar who said this? And I pushed the button and the name came down, Bart Ehrman. and so people really liked that. But Bart never answered, came back with anything. We're really safe for that. But he does this kind of stuff all the time. It's not only with his literature, he does it in textual criticism. When you read his academic book, The Orthodox Corruption of the Scriptures, and papers that he's read before the Society of Biblical Literature, he says basically that the New Testament we have today is pretty much what was originally written, with only a few areas in question. But when you read Misquoting Jesus, which is his popular, a best-selling book, he says things that lead you to believe at the very end that we can't be certain at all about what we have in the New Testament is what was originally written. So why does he do that? We can only speculate. Is he doing it because this sells? Academic books, you never sell a lot of those, but this would sell to the popular public,
Sure.
And he's got a recent book called Forged, in which he says that 19 of the 27 books and letters in the New Testament are forgeries. And a lot of that's just sizzle in there. And he only considers a very, very skeptical view. He doesn't present the other view for the most part. So why does he do these kinds of things? You got to wonder.
Yeah, sure.
But
it's because entertainment writing almost.
Yeah. But we really just don't know. We don't know why he does it. And not, for whatever reason he does it, that's between him and him. It's really not responsible history when you do that kind of stuff for sizzle and you mislead people into thinking things that you really don't even believe yourself. Fair question. Yes?
Okay. Back when I took a New Testament course many years ago, there was a lot of talk about the text of Q as being a sort of alternate source that then Matthew, Mark, and Luke all took from. I guess my question is, given that it really doesn't, to the best of my knowledge at least, it doesn't fit the responsible method, why is it still considered a plausible source?
Okay. The question's about Q. So I'm guessing that a lot of people in this room haven't heard about Q. What scholars have done over the years, they notice that there's a lot of common tradition between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are what are also called the synoptic gospels, because there's a lot of the similar content. In fact, about 90% of Mark is included in Matthew and Luke. So we really don't know for certain who used who. Most scholars believe that Mark was written first, but there are others that say Matthew was written first. Others say Luke was written first, or even some that say John was written first. We don't know for certain. We can only speculate and guess, but the majority today believe that Mark was first, and that Matthew and Luke used other sources, and one of those sources was Mark. I don't have any problems with that if that were the case. Okay, now here's what happens. When you have a text that's almost like word for word that's between, and it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, then they say that the ultimate source is Mark, and that Matthew and Luke also got that from Mark. Now, it's very conceivable that that was an oral tradition that was going around, and that all three included it in there, and it didn't come from Mark at all. It came from this oral tradition. So you see it can get a little bit complex here, and there's just uncertainty that shrouds the whole thing. Now, when you find that there's a certain tradition that's almost word for word, and let's say it's in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke. Maybe Luke reports it a little bit differently, like what Jesus said at the Last Supper. It communicates the same message, but when you read Luke's rendition of what Jesus said at the Last Supper, it's very similar to what Paul says Jesus said at the Last Supper, I think in 1 Corinthians 9. Might be chapter 11, I forgot which was, 9 or 11, where Paul quotes Jesus at the Last Supper. It's almost identical, word for word, with what Luke says. But Matthew and Mark have the same, almost word for word, what Jesus said. What that tells us is there were two different or independent sources that were being used. So now when we're looking for multiple independent sources, we have that for what Jesus said at the Last Supper. Check that out sometime, what Luke says and what Paul says, Jesus said, and what Matthew and Mark says. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. And go, oh, now that makes a lot of sense. Multiple independent sources. Now, was Luke using Paul? Probably not. Luke was probably using this oral tradition that Paul also knew. And Matthew and Mark were probably using an oral tradition, a separate one that was going around. Or it could be that Mark knew of the oral tradition and just wrote it in narrative form, and then Matthew used Mark as a source. We just don't know. These guys aren't around, so we have to speculate and improvise and try to put this together. But we do know that there, if Matthew wasn't using Mark, then there was a common source there that they're using. We know that Luke and Paul had access to a common source here, two independent sources. Now, here's what's going on. If Matthew and Mark say the same thing, New Testament scholars today typically like to say that that source is Mark. If Luke and Mark say the same thing, but Matthew doesn't say it, well then Luke is using Mark. If Matthew, Mark, and Luke are saying the same thing, the source is Mark. But there are plenty of occasions in the New Testament when Matthew and Luke are saying the same thing and it differs from Mark. So we know that they can't be getting it from Mark there. So they propose a hypothetical source that they just call Q, which means source in German. Okay, so I had to bring that up, right? Because she's taking German. So if it's in Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke, then the source is Mark, right? If it's in Luke and Mark, but not Matthew, the source is Mark. If it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the source is Mark. If it's in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, then Matthew and Luke are using Q. Now, what is Q is the question then. Is Q an oral tradition, or was it written? We don't know. No Q documents have ever been discovered. So what was it? We don't know. Now, I'll get to you in just a second. How credible is Q? What can we build? Can we build a theology on Q? No. There are some liberal biblical scholars today, like a John Kloppenborg, John Robinson, and some others who like to say that there was this Q community of Christians. And since the Q community doesn't mention things about Jesus like his resurrection, that Q didn't include, it was a Q gospel that didn't mention the resurrection of Jesus. And you say, wow, well this Q community must have been the most primitive of all Christian communities because they didn't have the resurrection. So the resurrection must have been a later teaching. And so they make up all these kinds of hypothetical Q communities, and they even go as far to say there was editing, technical terms, redaction of Q, and saying, wow, so you've got different levels, edited levels of Q, and we can see these along the way. Well, that is speculation squared. And when you start resorting to that kind of stuff, that's not responsible method. You've just left the realm of responsible historical method and gone into the realm of fantasy where X marks a spot and says here, there be dragons.